In this video on Romanticism, we will look at two authors, one of whom we've already encountered. So I'll just sort of briefly summarize some of his main aspects, and the other is a new one. And I have to admit that this one is sort of a personal favorite. Obviously, Blake counts as one of the so-called big six of Romanticism. Blake, Wordsworth, and Coleridge from the first generation, and Byron, Shelley, and Keats from the second generation. So he's certainly a central writer to Romanticism. But he's one of my personal favorites, so I really like to point out some of the oddities, because that's going to be sort of the theme of this, that he is one of the writers that, although he's part of Romanticism, falls out of many aspects. For one thing, he is older than most, older even than the first generation writers, Wordsworth and Coleridge. And he wasn't directly associated with any one of those groups. Wordsworth and Coleridge had a very strong friendship for all of their lives, and regularly met and lived next door to each other for a while, and collaborated on work. And then Byron, Keats, and Shelley also formed sort of a circle. Blake was outside of all of those groups. And also he was almost completely unknown in his own time. Now, there are many reasons for this relative anonymity. He was certainly too radical. He was too unconventional in his ideas, in his opinions, and also in his poetic form for his time. And particularly in his later work, he was too strongly reliant on his own mythical system. As you will see, the way that he brings his ideas about is that he creates his own myth. And if you didn't start with the myth right at the beginning, in the later works, you would get completely lost in this sort of private mythology. So when people read him at all, they often thought, particularly the larger work, that he was merely mad. And another interesting aspect that makes him almost invisible in his own time is actually his way of publishing his books. Blake himself called his technique illuminated printing, and that was an allusion to the illuminated manuscripts, the so-called illuminated medieval manuscripts, which were manuscripts that were illustrated by hand with colors. So what Blake did is he would write on copper plates with pen and brush, using a medium that was acid resistant. So he would write the text and the illustrations on the plate, which he had to do in mirror writing. So everything had to be reverse. But that allowed him to integrate illustration, integrate the graphic, the visual aspects of the text with the text itself. And normal printing methods would have distinguished. You would either have a piece of paper with text or with writing on it. And here he could integrate these. And then, as you can see here in this reconstruction, an acid would be poured on top of this, which would burn away everything where the acid-resistant paint isn't, and that would sort of etch this further down, and then you can use this as a printing plate, which he did. And then he would go on to hand color every single copy, give it different watercolors, and not even in the same way. Basically, all of his individual copies are unique. But you can imagine that this isn't a way to mass produce text. This is a way to produce, with a lot of labor, only very, very few of those. And this was what happened, that we have the original editions are just 10 to 20 copies. And of course, they were expensive back then. By now, all of these are unimaginably expensive pieces of art that are being shown in museums, of course. So if you find an original Blake in your attic, check out the prices on eBay. So this is how a plate would look like once it is printed. Just what he has etched, what he has written in this acid-resistant paint, and then etched it away, and then printed it, and then we can see in the next couple of slides how he would apply different forms of color. So I'm going to show you different copies of the same plate in different editions. So that hopefully gives you a good idea of how beautiful actually these plates are, and also how with Blake, we really need to take a look at these originals, because we can't just take the text out of this context of the illustrations. And you can see, if I'm allowed to scribble in here, you can see here that there are all these graphical elements right there in the text, which are also part of the whole piece of art. So with Blake, it's always important to have an understanding of how that actually looked like, and on top of that, for him, that method of printing wasn't just accidental, but it was actually a symbolic expression of what he wanted to do, because the idea that he had is that he develops a specific kind of poetic vision that, with acidic fire, burns away everything that is not true, and makes us see everything behind. So this burning away, this etching away everything that isn't meant for the truth is a very good symbol for what he does. If you're interested in Blake's art, and in actually experiencing the whole range of his illustrations and illuminations, that would be a good place to go to. The Blake Archive, which has scans of all of his illuminated works in all of the copies that are extant. So you can really browse through hundreds of these pages, and marvel in the colors and then the different ways that he renders these scenes. But as I said, this isn't just for show. This isn't just for looking beautiful. It is actually part of what Blake is after. This idea of a poetic vision, and this is directly voiced against the notion of reason, of empiricism that we have encountered in Enlightenment thinking and in neoclassical thinking. So in this way, Blake, who's the oldest of the Romantic writers, is really sort of a forerunner in this revolt against a restriction, as Blake would have seen it, towards reason. Blake develops two figures particularly that are sort of symbolic of this misguided and this confining notion of reason. One of them is Newton. You see him here in a graphic version by Blake himself. You see that he's sort of sitting and kind of embedded in this rock, and the rock is always of an image of the material world, the unbending and limiting world. And as you can see, what Newton does here is he makes a circle, which is also sort of a symbol of confinement. So Newton, for him, was someone who reduced the world to that which is physical, which is material. Remember Newton devising the laws of gravity, and becoming by doing that, becoming one of the poster boys for Enlightenment thinking. This confidence that you can do this, you can find these rules, and but the rule for Blake was something that was extremely limiting. But not only sort of the scientific method was something that he attacked. He sort of enlarged his vision of a constricting notion of reason with his major mythological character, which he called Urizen. And you can read this as your reason, which actually sounds like your reason, although you could also read it like horizon, and then it sounds like horizon, which is, of course, after all, again, the circumference, the circle that limits what we can see of the world. And your reason for him is this figure of a creator of a physical and therefore unbending universe. You can see him here in this is certainly the most iconic image that Blake creates, calls it the Ancient of Days. And you can also see that this Urizen is sort of draws on Christian imagery of a patriarchal God as well. And this is another part of the critique that Blake develops here. This notion of as he calls him in one place, the noble daddy, this father figure that wants to bring everyone under his law. And you see here how the hands, we can either read them as the thunderbolts of a god like Zeus, for example, but we can also see them as another way to make a circle. And this is what Urizen does. He creates the world. But by doing that, he actually already confines it. He already ends sort of the energetic development. So these are figures that show how Blake opposes this what had been sort of the most important and the thing that people needed to aspire to in Enlightenment thinking. But for him, all of that was limitation. And in that respect, he sort of chimed with political developments that we've looked at, the French Revolution, these ideas that we need to break the chains, the social chains that bind us, the political chains that bind us. But Blake went further, because what he was really interested in was what we might call mental limitation, the chains that are actually in our mind. Just sort of as an exemplification, I would quote this passage from one of his most well-known shorter novels, London, when he, or the speaker, who is a visionary, says, "In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear." Manacles are chains, and they're mind-forged because they're only there in our mind, but they're what limits us. So against this, he sets other figures that stand for opposing principles, energy and poetic vision. So first one here is Orc, the embodiment of creative passion and energy that stands in opposition to Urizen and to the embodiment of tradition. That's also the spirit of rebellion, of revolution that sweeps throughout Europe, and that breaks apart the stony laws, as he says. This is Urizen is the one that brings stony laws, and we of course are supposed to think of the Ten Commandments, which are actually written down in stone and unbending. And Orc against this is pure energy. And this also shows how unconventional Blake really is for his own time. If you look at this, the imagery of Orc, you can see that he has an ancestor, of course, in Prometheus, who brings the flame to humans, but also in Satan as a rebel, Satan as a revolutionary that we have encountered in Milton. And Blake, after all, is one of those persons who claims that Milton really, because he was a true poet, was of the devil's side without knowing it. And that's why the passages in hell are so much more interesting than the ones in heaven. So for him, Satan, in this respect, represents energy. And he, in one of his philosophical texts, he really puts most conventions of both morality and religion on its head. As he says here, all Bibles or sacred codes have been the causes of the following errors. First, that man has two real existing principles, namely a body and a soul. That energy, called evil, is alone from the body, and that reason, called good, is alone from the soul. And third, that God will torment man in eternity for following his energies. But the following contraries to these are true. Man has no body distinct from his soul, for that which is called body is a portion of soul discerned by the five senses. So that's a great way to put it. It's like we don't have this distinction of body and soul, which was one of the foundations of theological thinking and philosophical thinking for centuries. Is that no, it's really just one thing, but the body is all that we can see with our limited perception. That's the material part of our body. So that called body is a portion of soul discerned by the five senses, which are the chief inlets of soul in this age. Energy is the only life and is from the body, and reason is the bound or outward circumference of energy. Right? Again, reason is that which binds us, which distinguishes the inside from the outside, and that binds energy. Energy is eternal delight. So just a one quote to show how far outside of the mainstream of thinking Blake really was in his own time. And of course, being a true romantic, one of the other characters that oppose the constriction of reason is the figure of loss, who's usually associated most closely with the imagination. We've seen that imagination is a sort of a central aspect of romantic thinking. So loss is an embodiment of the poetic vision. He's the poet, the artist, who brings that kind of vision that doesn't repeat things merely, that doesn't mirror things merely, but that really creates with artistic vision. Here's another great quote from one of his longer works that is uttered by Loss. I must create a system or be enslaved by another man's. I will not reason and compare. My business is to create. So if you don't create your own system, you're enslaved by another man's, which explains why Blake goes on to invent his own complete system of mythology, which makes it admittedly a little bit hard to get into his later works, but it's certainly worth it because you won't find any other writer anywhere who is as strictly his own thing and really is different from all the other writers. So against this limiting vision of empiricism, of Newtonian classicism that sees only that which we can see, smell, touch, feel, he sets his own poetic vision. And poetic vision is, as we said, it's what burns everything away and makes us see further and makes us see things that we haven't seen with our normal eyes. And this was one of his major tasks to enhance our vision, to enhance our perception, and to make us experience these things that our limited vision can't show us. Another very famous quote by Blake is this: if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, and that is infinite. So the doors of perception need to be cleansed, and it's the artist's job basically to do that for us, to provide us with a vision of things as they really are. So this notion of the doors of perception, that is one of the things that, and obviously in his own time, people would say, what, this man is crazy. What is he talking about? But it was really in the second half of the 19th century that Blake is discovered for the first time, and it is then in the middle of the 20th century that he is really appreciated for the visionary thinker that he actually is, and particularly also through his idea of enhancing our vision. And you can maybe see where that is going. So there's for example this book by Aldous Huxley about his experiences with LSD, with psychedelic drugs, and he calls that the doors of perception. So that was one of those ways to cleanse the doors of perception and to actually see the infinite in everything. And then there was this student of literature in California who thought, well, that's a great notion, the doors of perception. Why don't we make that the name of our band? And that is, of course, the Doors, who are named after this idea of the doors of perception. So most of these thoughts are really developed and fleshed out in his later and larger works, long poems, mythological poems that are very, very different, difficult to get to, what he called prophecies, and that sort of takes some getting used to, and you basically sort of need to read up on the whole mythology or read yourself into that. But there's a much easier way to experience Blake, and this is the Blake that is most well known, and this is his shorter lyrical works that were all published in this collection, this sort of twofold collection of poems, Songs of Innocence and Experience. So this is the title page in one of its versions of Songs of Innocence and of Experience. You can see here, maybe you can read it, that the subtitle is Showing the Two Contrary States of the Human Soul. And this is really what he wanted to show, sort of these two states that humans can be in, which of course is something that relates to Christian theology, this idea of the fall, of a Edenic innocence and a fall from this innocence into experience. So innocence is associated with childhood, and with the redemptive religion of Christ as well. So you have the Songs of Innocence, and the form of them matches this idea of being innocent, being childlike, being uncomplicated. So you can see that in the designs, you can see that in the topics, and you can see that in the poetic form. These poems really usually sound like nursery rhymes or children's songs. The sun does arise and make happy the skies, the merry bells ring to welcome the spring, the skylark and thrush, the birds of the bush, sing louder around to the bell's cheerful sound, while our sports shall be seen on the echoing green. Experience, on the other hand, is a state of knowledge of good and evil, of knowing that there is evil in the world, of restrictions, of death, and of sin. So this is the place where he can voice, for example, social criticism. One of the most famous set of poems is the Chimney Sweeper. You can see here both the innocent and the experienced version of the chimney sweepers. And chimney sweepers were young boys who worked as chimney sweepers because they would fit into the chimneys. They would actually crawl through the chimneys and clear them of soot because grown men couldn't do this. And of course, you can just imagine that this is it's not just terrible that kids have to do this work, but it's actually really, really terrible work. Very, very unhealthy, and many kids died while doing this, and because of diseases didn't get better, very old. So in the second one, in the experienced chimney sweeper, the child is much more aware of this and is actually sort of starting to accuse society, is accusing the church as an institution of not doing anything against this practice. So we have these two sides, and it seems to be rather straightforward. But I want to complicate these matters a little bit by pointing to what we might call the paradox of innocence, and this also is supposed to be sort of a model lesson in being careful with easy texts. This is something that students like to do when they choose something for an exam. They think, okay, this is an easy text. I understood it, no problem. So this is not going to be difficult in an exam. First of all, it is usually easier to say something clever about a difficult text than it is to say something clever about an easy text. But then some texts might not be as easy as they seem. So let's take a look at the introduction to the Songs of Innocence. This is how it starts. Piping down the valleys wild, piping songs of pleasant glee, on a cloud I saw a child, and he laughing said to me, pipe a song about a lamb. So I piped with merry cheer, Piper, pipe that song again. So I piped. He wept to hear. Drop thy pipe, thy happy pipe, sing thy songs of happy cheer. So I sung the same again, while he wept with joy to hear. Piper, sit thee down and write in a book that all may read. So he vanished from my sight, and I plucked a hollow reed. And I made a rural pen, and I stained the water clear, and I wrote my happy songs every child may joy to hear. So on the surface, this is a nice little children's tale about how the speaker of these poems meets this child. We can think of maybe Jesus, or just sort of an innocent child that asks to hear this song about a lamb. Although lamb, of course, would also make these associations to Christ as the Lamb of God and so on. And this is sort of the origin of these stories, and in the end he writes them down. But what we also have, one thing that we also have in this story is basically a media history that starts with the most abstract form of art, a media and art history, if you will. It starts with the most abstract form of art, and that is music, pure music, piping. So there is no words, there is just this music. And the original request is to pipe a song about a lamb. Now, how do you do that? Because the music isn't concrete. And then the next thing is that he says, well, sing the song. So what he does then is he sings, which means that he uses language and makes it more concrete. And then he asks him to actually write it down, to put it down into writing, which has, of course, the advantage that now more people can actually hear it than those who are immediately present. That's the great thing about writing, that you can write something down and you can actually even copy it and distribute it, and people can read it years later. So you have that distributive quality. But if you look closely, you can see that there's also something lost in that process. In this process from this original vision, which is pure music, which then gets translated into text, which then gets written down. One thing that is, of course, lost from singing to writing it down is the music. The music is gone. Now that if you can open the book and read it, but you can't hear the music anymore. And now if you look at the wording here, you can see that the moment that he's about to write this down, the original vision is gone, right? He vanished from my sight, because we could say, well, his job is done, but also this original vision, this original inspiration is already gone. And then he makes this rural pen, as he says, by cutting his own reed and to write, and he stains the water clear. So the water needs to be stained in order to make ink, that he can actually write this down. But what we can see is that this process of having an original vision and then translating that into an actual concrete work of art is also a loss of the visionary nature of the original, and a loss of expression. And that should sort of remind us of what I talked about, the aesthetics of unattainability, that this is sort of a central topos of romantic thinking, that you have this original vision that you need to translate into a piece of art, but that is already a fall, that is already a loss. And in the same way, you can't talk about innocence, knowing what innocence is, while being innocent. Because if you know what innocence is, that means you are already not innocent anymore, because then you know the difference between innocence and experience. And that's the paradox of innocence, that it tries to recreate a state that is, once you know it, is already unattainable. Now, while the Songs of Innocence and Experience, when they originally came out, didn't really find a lot of reception, didn't find a lot of echo, another text did and reverberated throughout the next couple of decades, and really was understood by already by the contemporaries and even more so by later literary historians as sort of a birthing place of English Romanticism, and that is the collection of poems called Lyrical Ballads. Now, Lyrical Ballads was written and published by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, so those two writers from the first generation of Romantic writers who collaborated on this, and first published it in 1798. We usually put the date of 1800 there as well, because Wordsworth considerably expanded the collection with more of his own poems, and also added a very important preface to the collection in 1800, which was seen or is now understood as one of the major programmatic texts of Romantic writing. So often this is regarded as the beginning. We've talked about the periodization of Romanticism, and sort of the literary period could be said to start in 1798 with the publication of the Lyrical Ballads. The immediate effect was modest. It wasn't a huge success, but it became and it remains a landmark. And a second edition, 1800, then further edition 1801, 1802, 1805. So we see that interest remains steady, and people start reading this and demanding it and being influenced by this. There are many programmatic features of this collection. Perhaps more vividly than any other poetical work of the period, the Lyrical Ballad documents Romanticism's impulse to merge artistic with social change. We saw that also already with Blake, this idea that we change everything by changing vision, and similarly Wordsworth and Coleridge by changing art wanted to change the world. So they didn't start directly with social critique and social analysis like an Enlightenment and classical writer would have, but by reforming poetry rather. So it was important, for example, that it features subjects from ordinary life, such as could be found in every village in its vicinity. And the collection expresses in this way Wordsworth's conviction, which he phrased years later in a letter, that men who do not wear fine clothes can feel deeply. So to take these normal people, ordinary people, common folks, poor people, and to give them a depth of feeling that was unprecedented. So that was already revolutionary, to talk about beggars and vagrants as if they had a deep emotional life. Something that for us might feel absolutely normal, but we have to remember that this was still very, very uncommon in its own time. So for Wordsworth and Coleridge, this egalitarian depiction of emotion was part of a larger model of literary reform, maybe even of revolution, that required the repudiation of 18th century modes of feeling and expressions. Lyrical ballads views English poetry as an exhausted institution that was desperately needing to be regrounded in natural human passions, in human characters and human incidents, so that had drifted away from this natural aspect of humanity. So the volume rejects the manipulative emotionality of sensibility, this purely designing everything so that we feel and that we press out more tears. So be more realistic than that, but also rejects the aestheticism of neoclassical diction that is focused on order and form and everything. Instead, it was aspiring to convey authentic human feelings by way of simple ballads. That this is the title here, after all, Lyrical Ballads. So these are ballads that take up there's sort of a hybrid between original ballads. They're often narrative in their form, that they tell a story, but they're lyrical in the way that they're heightened in their artistic endeavor and in the range of emotions that come to play in them. Um, it asserts that such lower forms of diction, which generally had been shunned by the university-educated poets who would not write ballads, are in fact a valid medium for philosophical poetry. And in this way, the collection had a galvanizing influence on the Romantic era. It's um, Later literary historians have sort of debated the originality. How new was this? But the point is that it was perceived as new. Wordsworth and Coleridge were seeing themselves as literary revolutionaries, and others read them in the same way, and this started them on their own development as writers. So and this is something that is a little bit difficult to do when we read these texts now, and they read just like rather conventional old poetry. We have to bring ourselves into a frame of mind in which these are experiments. This is experimental poetry that breaks most of the conventions of poetry of its own time, and that was seen as revolutionary by contemporaries. So we've already heard a lot about William Wordsworth in some of the examples that I started when talking about Romanticism and later on. So I just want to bring this together here to say that he is regarded as maybe the central figure in English Romanticism. You can see that, as you will see, in contrast to many of the other writers, he had a long life that went well into the Victorian period. And that's already, I think I mentioned this, one of the characteristics of his trajectory as a poet, that he starts out as a young writer with texts like the lyrical ballads that are youthful, rebellious, revolutionary even, and optimistic. And then through his disappointment in the French Revolution, he turns into a more conservative thinker. Some would even say reactionary thinker. And at the same time, his fame grows, so he becomes in his own lifetime sort of a poetic institution in England, and is sort of revered and reviled by later generations of poets. On the left-hand side, you can also see one of his houses that he lived in as a younger man, and that's another thing that is noteworthy, of course, that this generation of Romantic writers was also intensely associated with a specific part of England, and that is the Lake District in the north of England, which they lived in and wrote about and used as a way to sort of to express this the position that nature had in their own philosophy and in their own aesthetics. And the text that I want to talk about briefly here at the end is what is now considered his major work, the Prelude. We've opened with a passage from the Prelude, really his autobiographic poem, as we would maybe nowadays call it. The Prelude was written in several stages. The first version was written over a period of 7 years, 1798 to 1805. So you see, he starts it in the same year that the lyrical ballads are being published. But Wordsworth kept revising it for much of the rest of his life. So he constantly rewrote, added passages, changed passages, and as a fact, in 1850, when he died, it was still left unfinished. So what we can trace through these different versions is also his own development as a writer, and that opens up very interesting questions of which one is which is the true Prelude. Should we read the 1850 version, which he has revised as an old man? Or there are many people who say, well, I actually like the earlier versions better. He makes revisions into his philosophy and most importantly, of course, to his politics. So you can actually choose which of those versions of Wordsworth actually you like best and which you want to read. So most good editions would actually carry the different versions of the prelude as well. The first form that it took was less than 1,000 lines, which we can only reconstruct from manuscript, and it was only published very recently. And later that was amplified to 14 books comprising about 8,000 lines. So it grows substantially, as you can see. Now, what this is, we could simply call it an autobiographical poem, but what Wordsworth was really after was a renewal of the tradition of the epic. And this here is sort of a next step, if you will, in the development of the epic. It is the great epic of human consciousness, measuring Wordsworth's own position against the aspirations of Milton particularly. Milton had seen his own Christian epic, Paradise Lost, as replacing the ancient pagan tradition of Homer and Virgil. And Wordsworth saw that progression, and in a passage from his own book, from an 1805 version of Book 3, he confidently added himself to this list, this tradition of epic writing, and saw himself as sort of the next step. It's not that he regards his work as post-Christian, but that he takes for his theme not a mythological or a religious subject, but rather the human mind, and an individual human mind, and the human mind of someone who isn't anything spectacular. It's not Achilles. He's not a great hero. That's not what he claims. I opened this chapter with this sort of snide by Keats, calling it the egotistical sublime, to see oneself as sublime. But the point isn't that Wordsworth wants to show that he is more interesting than anyone else, but rather that he is the only one whose mind he has the same access to. So he needs to write about himself. So this is really what he does. He tries to sketch the development of a mind. You see this here in this passage when he says, "Of genius, power, creation, and divinity itself I have been speaking, for my theme has been what passed within me, not of outward things, done visibly for other minds, words, signs, symbols, or actions, but of my own heart have I been speaking, and my youthful mind." So this is really the revolution in epic writing that he brings about, and this is where this whole development that we've sketched away from the Middle Ages in early modernism, that man becomes interesting to himself, finds a sort of apotheosis where someone says, "Look, I'm going to write a whole epic, 8,000 lines of poetry, merely about my own mind and how that developed and what influenced it, and I will sort of ponder on this." One might say that the dominant theme at the core of the prelude is the awakening of the imagination through experiences of childhood and adolescence. He pays a lot of attention to his early life, which is of course formative for his mental development. So the prelude records a number of intensely emotional encounters between the poet as a child or as a youth and various aspects of natural environment. Moments of heightened awareness that he calls spots of time, through which his imaginative capacity seemed somehow to be nourished. We've looked already at the climbing of Mount Snowdon episode. Here you see an illustration of another episode where he steals a rowing boat in the night and rows out, and then the moon rises, and he thinks about that experience. This is not merely simply nature poetry. The external physical world is significant only in relation to the poet's inquiry into his own nature as one who sees himself both as a representative of other people and also as set apart from them by his own special literary vocation. So it is really the growth of a poet's mind, because the poet, as we will see in Percy Shelley, is the legislator of the world. The poet is the one that gives that vision, and that was the same claim that Blake made, that it is the visionary poet who makes us understand these things, or at least see that these things are out there and possible.